Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show, brought to you by Tissot, official timing partners of the Tour de France. This week, we'll be wrapping up the 2021 edition of the race and the most dominant performance that we have seen for years. Is there anybody who will be able to dethrone Tadej Pogačar in the coming years? Yes, and I will tell you why. Was it the first Grand Tour he won on disc brakes? No, and I'll also tell you why. The Tour de France drew to a conclusion yesterday with Wout van Aert taking his third stage win of the race, spoiling the party for Mark Cavendish. More on that later on, but 71 positions behind Van Aert, Tadej Pogačar rolled across the line to claim his second successive Tour de France overall win, only 10 months after his first. His margin over second place Jonas Vingegaard was a whopping 5 minutes and 20 seconds. His margin over 10th place Rigoberto Urán was 18 minutes and 34 seconds. But you don't have to go too far back to find even bigger gaps. 7 years ago, in 2014, runner-up Jean-Christophe Perrault finished the 3 weeks 7 minutes and 37 seconds behind Vincenzo Nibali. And in 10th place that year was Bauke Mollema, over 21 minutes down on the Italian. However, that remains Nibali's only Tour de France victory, but for Pogačar, it's already his second at the age of just 22. To find the last person to take their second Tour de France a year after their first, or in this case 10 months after, you have to go a lot further back. Lance Armstrong achieved it in the year 2000, but if you don't count that because it's been erased from the history books, you have to go back to Miguel Indurain in 1992, almost 30 years ago. The manner of Pogačar's victory this year was in complete contrast to his first one. He was utterly dominant, and as much as we hoped that it wasn't the end of the race, it was effectively over after he put almost 3.5 minutes into all his rivals on stage 8 to Le Grand Bornand. On only 2 of the 21 stages did he lose any time to any rival. Firstly, on stage 3, where he was caught behind a crash and eventually crossed the line 26 seconds behind the lead group containing Richard Carapaz, and on the stage 20 time trial, where he conceded 25 seconds to Vingegaard. Yes, some of his rivals were injured or had crashed out completely, but it was the most dominant Tour de France win we've seen in many years. Like last year, he not only went home with the yellow jersey, but also the white and polka dot as best young rider and king of the mountains too. And it makes you wonder, is this the Pogačar era? Will he win the next 3, 4 or even 5 Tours de France? And it's easy to make a case to say that he will. He can climb, he can time trial, he doesn't crash very often, he copes with all types of weather, his team is recruiting better riders to support him, he doesn't seem fazed by pressure, money or fame, and he's only 22. Nobody has ever won 2 editions of the Tour de France at a younger age. And this Tour de France was his 15th stage race as a pro rider, and he's won 8 of them. It's scary, not just for his rivals, but also for those of us who are neutral and want to see a battle for the GC that's not settled by the end of the first week. And so, to give us some hope, I'm going to make a case for why Pogačar won't dominate the race for years to come. First up, he might do the Giro and the Vuelta next year instead. No, I'm only joking. First up, Jonas Vingegaard. So Pogačar said in a post-stage interview that Vingegaard has a bright future. And it was quite strange to hear from someone that's 2 years younger, but it is true. The Dane was the only rider to outclimb Pogačar, putting 40 seconds into him by the top of the second ascent of Mont Ventoux on stage 11. And the fact that he is so good at time trialling is particularly promising. So often we get gifted climbers who lose big chunks of time against the clock. And it also helps that he rides for Jumbo-Visma, a team yet to win the Tour de France, but who've clearly proven they are capable of doing so in the right circumstances. The conundrum for that team, though, is how they approach the race next year. Roglic is the more proven performer in stage races, but Vingegaard has just equalled his best Tour de France result. Will they put the Dane in the Giro, or will they dare to go for the two-pronged attack at Le Tour? I personally hope it's the latter. There were also some notable riders beyond Roglic who were absent from the Tour de France this year. Not least Egan Bernal, a rider we also thought could dominate the Tour de France for years to come when he won the race 2 years ago. Now interestingly, the two have only ever finished one stage race together. That was at this year's Tirreno Adriatico. Pogačar won, Bernal was 4th, and lost 43 seconds to the Slovenian in the final 10-kilometre time trial. Remco Evenepoel wasn't at the Tour de France either, and despite being as yet unproven as a Grand Tour contender, many think he will be. His team manager, Patrick Lefevere, has said he won't be doing the Tour de France next year, but even if he did, he would already be older than Pogačar was when he first won the race. I'm not doing very well here in my argument against Pogačar domination, am I? Perhaps the biggest indication, though, that he might not win the next however many Tours de France is Pogačar himself. His win last year and Bernal's the year before that were proof that the changing of the guard can happen far quicker than we expect. The rider who knocks Pogačar off his perch might not even be a professional rider yet. I mean, it could be Juan Ayuso, an 18-year-old Spanish super talent who recently won 3 stages and the GC at the under-23 Giro d'Italia. There's just a small sticking point with that one. Ayuso turned pro just after that win and is now teammates with Pogačar. What do you think though? Are we all set to see Pogačar win the Tour de France for years to come? And if not, why not? Let me know in the comment section below, and also by taking part in our poll on the GCN app, a link to which you can find on screen now. Just before we move on from Pogačar, let's have the debate that matters the most though. Is he the first rider to win a Grand Tour on disc brakes? I would say no. On all 3 of his stage wins, he was using rim brakes. Why? Probably because of weight on the road bike. Apparently the disc brake bike is about 100 grams over the UCI minimum weight limit, and also because Colnago don't make a time trial bike with disc brakes. However, Pogačar did use disc brakes on the stage 8, which is where he put the most time into his rivals, and I guess that was because the finish there was at the end of a descent rather than at the summit, so maybe my argument is flawed on this one too. Either way, I know there are many of you out there who are big fans of rim brakes, and this year's Tour de France is proof that they are not dead yet. Moving on now to some other stories from the last week of the race, and one of the biggest was of the Bahrain Victorious team hotel, which was raided by French police on the evening of stage 17. They were at the hotel until the early hours of the morning, searching the riders' rooms, their phones and laptops, and taking away training files and other data. Now, according to the Marseille Prosecution Office, which is the same department who searched Nairo Quintana's room at last year's race, they were looking into the possible acquisition, transportation, possession and importing of a prohibited substance or method for use by an athlete without justification by members of Team Bahrain Victorious, currently in action at the 2021 Tour de France. Now, there have been no further reports since then, and nothing to suggest they found anything to prove their allegations. We'll wait and see if anything emerges over the coming weeks and months. Bahrain have denied any wrongdoing and said that they comply with everything that was asked of them by the French police. And Tadej Pogačar was particularly defiant after that raid, going on the attack on stage 18, which went over the Col de Tourmalet, and then again the following stage, which he won. He attacked and went solo with over 25 Ks to go, never to be seen again. His celebration across the line, though, was a controversial one, because the zipping of the lips is something we saw Lance Armstrong do back in the day. This was what Pogačar had to say in his post-stage interview.
Especially, I was thinking mostly about what happened 2 days ago in the evening when I felt like a criminal, no? With all the police coming to our hotel. From one point of view, it's a good thing, because that means that there is still control over the peloton, and they are checking all the teams, and of course they didn't find anything because we had nothing to hide, no? So yes, at one point, from one point of view it's a good thing, but from another point of view I a little bit felt disappointed with the system, you know, because they were super, it's not a nice thing when the police walks into your room and searches all your belongings, even if you have nothing to hide. It feels a little bit weird, no? It never happened to me before, and then when they go through your personal photos, through the photos of your family, of your, through your phone, through your messages, it feels a little bit, like this. But then at the end of the day, I have nothing to hide, so I'm not super, I don't care too much about other people checking through my stuff, so yeah, it's okay at the end, I hope.
Pogačar is a particularly intelligent pro cyclist, both on and off the bike. He always speaks eloquently and from the heart. I know that many long-term fans of cycling were surprised to see his celebration, but I think we've all got to remember that Pogačar was only 10 years old when Armstrong made that same gesture in 2004. He hadn't even started riding a bike by that point, and so it is more than plausible that he wasn't even aware of how it had been used in the past. Pogačar is also a rider who uploads his rides and races and power to Strava, so he's also very open from that point of view. And incidentally, his average power for the final 20 minutes of that stage he won was 365 watts, and his weight is set on Strava at 71 kilograms, so certainly not out of this world. Now, my personal opinion, and I know there are people who disagree with this, is that it's a good thing these police investigations are happening, even if nothing untoward is going on. It's not nice for the riders or the staff. It was very disruptive to them in the biggest race of the season, but It is a message to every team and every rider that the authorities are keeping a close eye on anything that they feel is remotely suspicious. And that, hopefully, will make anyone who is thinking of cheating think twice. Meanwhile, taking the green jersey for just the second time in his career was Mark Cavendish. It wasn't to be the fairy tale ending for him or for Deceuninck Quick-Step, but with 4 stage wins for Cavendish, 5 in total, equaling the record of Eddy Merckx and Alaphilippe animating almost every stage that wasn't a sprint, I think the team can go home, or in some cases to Tokyo, with their heads held very high. Right, it's going to be a long time, I think, before anybody else gets close to 34 Tour de France stage wins, if ever. And who's to say he's finished there? He could potentially add to his tally this time next year, and you'd imagine that his motivation will be pretty high once the dust has settled on this year's race. For Jumbo-Visma, it turned out to be a very successful race, despite losing their leader in the first week. Van Aert continued to underline his pedigree as the best all-round rider in the world, taking 3 very different stage wins. 1 in the mountains, 1 in a time trial, and 1 in the most prestigious bunch sprint in cycling. The last rider to have achieved that feat, 3 stage wins in completely different disciplines, was Bernard Hinault, 42 years ago in 1979. Meanwhile, Sepp Kuss took his first ever stage win at the race, and the first for an American rider in 10 years. And Vingegaard, of course, finished second in the overall classification, which was an absolutely fantastic ride. It wasn't, though, quite such a successful race for INEOS Grenadiers. They had to set up a third step of the podium with Richard Carapaz. Now, for most teams, that would be a successful race, but not for a team with their budget and their expectations. That is 2 successive years now in which they haven't won the Tour de France, something which hasn't happened since the first 2 years that they existed as Team Sky. The last time they didn't win a stage or the GC was in 2014, and that was when Chris Froome pulled out through injury in the first week of the race. This year, their 4-pronged attack soon became just 1 prong after a crash-blighted first week of racing, and it's going to be very interesting to see how they approach the race next year. Geraint Thomas will be 36 by then, and as yet has not renewed his contract with the team. Carapaz's consistency is impressive. He's now won or finished on the podium at all 3 Grand Tours, but then he loses time to his key rivals in the time trials, and then is unable to outclimb them in the mountains. So, will they buy in the talent to challenge Pogačar, or will one of the young riders already within their ranks rise to the challenge, maybe Tom Pidcock, for example? It's going to be fascinating to see how they attempt to get back to winning ways at next year's Tour de France. Anyway, on to the question that I know you are all asking yourselves. Is the GCN curse finally over?
Tadej Pogačar.
Tadej Pogačar.
Tadej Pogačar.
Tadej Pogačar.
And yes, we have ignored Connor's prediction of Richie Porte there.
Richie Porte.
But either way, I don't think it's ever going to get better than that for us. Maybe we should retire our predictions now whilst we're on the top. And chapeau to Ben O'Connor, 4th overall at the Tour de France, a new hope for Australian cycling. I'm sure he'll go on to bigger and better things, but even if he doesn't, that is a result that most pro cyclists can only dream of. This is how the rest of the top 10 looked. Wilco Kelderman rode a solid race to finish 5th, Enric Mas 6th, Lutsenko 7th, Guillaume Martin, the best French rider, in 8th, Bilbao 9th, and Aran slipping down to 10th after his form eluded him in the final week of racing. Bahrain victorious went home with the team's classification as well as their 3 stage wins. The Combativity Award went to Frank Bonamore of B&B Hotels, and an unofficial award went to Chris Froome, ASO deeming him the most friendly and polite rider in the peloton. And that wraps up the Tour de France for another year. But just before I get on to what's coming up on GCN Plus, I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of you who tuned in for our coverage of the Tour de France. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. It was a real pleasure from our end. Now, things are a little bit quieter this coming week, but then we do have the Olympic Games, which is a pretty big deal, isn't it? Saturday is the men's road race and Sunday the women's over in Tokyo. We've got live coverage available throughout Europe on GCN Plus, and if you don't fancy getting up in the middle of the night to watch those races, we'll have them available on demand and highlights too after the events. The following week, we'll also have the cross-country mountain bike events and the start of the track racing at the IZU Velodrome, plus the time trials, of course, too. But that's not the only race we've got coming this week either. The Tour de Wallonie has live coverage for the final 3 stages on Thursday, Friday and Saturday, with Nizzolo, Lampart, Seneschal and Gaviria amongst the big names taking part in that race. And that one is available in all GCN Plus territories. Right, I will finish with some more transfer and retirement news. First up, John Degenkolb, who was not selected to race for Lotto Soudal at the Tour de France, is apparently signed to Team DSM for next year. That'll be a bit of a homecoming for him because he spent 5 years with that team under a different name near the start of his career. Trek Segafredo announced the signing of 3 young riders: Filippo Baroncini, a 20-year-old Italian who's pretty handy in time trials, 22-year-old Dutchman Dan Hull, and 22-year-old Dane Ashbourne Hellemos, who's finished in the top 10 in GC at the under-23 Giro for the past 2 years in succession. And finally, Andre Greipel has announced that he will retire at the end of this season. Over his 16-year pro career, he has so far amassed 158 wins, so an average of almost 10 per season. Incredible. 4 of those were at the Vuelta, 7 at the Giro d'Italia and 11 at the Tour de France. He also made the Tour Down Under his own for a number of years, with 18 stage wins there and 2 overall wins. Let's hear what Greipel had to say on that now.
I wish everybody a good time in the pro peloton, and of course I won't be away from cycling. I hope somehow to stay in cycling, and everybody who supported me throughout my career, my family, of course, my trainers, and everybody whoever was part of me, of my career. I'm really thankful, and we see us around.
Despite being known as the gorilla throughout his career, Greipel is a gentle giant and widely regarded as one of the nicest and most respected guys in the pro peloton. And he should also be commended for his work off the bike, where he's raised awareness and thousands of euros to help fight the brain disease ALS. You've been a brilliant ambassador for the sport, Andre. We wish you the very best in your retirement. Right, that is all for this week. I'm off for a bit of rest and recovery now, but I'll be back on Monday next week to round up the action from the Olympic road races and the Tour de Wallonie. See you then, but goodbye for now.